Well, it's very good to be with you. On March 18th, 2023, the weekend that marks the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the shock and awe invasion of Iraq, an invasion that was illegal and based on lies and based on deception, based on a violation of international law, not to mention U.S. law, an invasion that took the lives of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, according to most objective estimates, including the Lancet Medical Journal from the UK. Thousands of Americans came together in front of the White House, carrying flag-draped coffins representing the people not only in Iraq, but in Syria, in Libya, in Palestine, in Somalia, in Syria. People all over the Middle East, South Asia, North Africa, who have lost their lives, and the number may be in the millions at this point, lost their lives because of an endless U.S. war drive, which for 20 years was anchored in the Middle East, anchored in the resource-rich region of the world where 2/3 of the world's known oil is. But a war drive that has now shifted starting in 2018 with a new doctrinal reorientation by the Pentagon in its quadrennial report, such that the U.S. is now preparing for what it identifies as major power conflict, meaning confrontation and war with Russia and with China. And this new doctrine is, like the old doctrine, something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The war on terror that was adopted as the official doctrine of the U.S. after the September 11th terrorist attacks became a self-fulfilling prophecy. The U.S. went to war in Iraq. It went to war in Libya. It carried out a proxy war in Syria, attempting to smash and destroy that government. Now the U.S. has shifted. The war on terror is old school, kind of passé, not that interesting. Let's get ready for a war with Russia and China. So here we are, 20 years later, thousands of Americans are gathering at the White House saying, we don't want endless war. We don't want major power conflict. Let's be realistic. The United States went to war in Afghanistan and could not defeat the Taliban after 20 years, was driven from Afghanistan by the Taliban. But now the American people are told, yeah, we couldn't defeat the Taliban, but let's have a war with the People's Liberation Army in China or with Russia. So this is madness. This is insanity. And yet it is the biggest business in the United States. It's incentivized as a way for capitalist corporations to make immense profits, and we get nothing in return except the promise of more death and destruction. So that's why we were there in Washington, thousands of us marching on the White House, marching on the Washington Post, which is just a propaganda arm for the war machine. And while we were doing that in Washington, thousands of people were marching in other cities, in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in Columbus, Ohio, in San Antonio, Texas. So what we are seeing on the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War and 1 year after the U.S. proxy war with Russia began is a new anti-war movement is starting to take shape in the United States.
Thank you for your introduction. A lot of times we talk about people-to-people exchange. We say Chinese people love peace. But the fact is, I think people anywhere, the people all love peace because war affects our livelihoods, affects everybody's livelihood, maybe with the exception of the very few elites, power, political elites or economic elites, but they get to make the call. They got to make the decision. This is kind of tragic because you see on American press, a lot of columnists are reflecting upon the 20 years or so endless war or perpetual war in Afghanistan and Iraq. America is always intertwined in overseas conflict. It begs the question that why is America involved in those places at all? At all. It just suddenly occurs to me that America, you call your Department of Defense, the DoD, what are they defending against? Against whom? From whom? It sounds to me it should be renamed as DOA, Department of Attack or Aggression, because with hundreds of military bases dotting the world, there's no way that you're honestly telling people that you are defending your country as a democratic republic on its surface, but in fact, it's a world empire. Let's just face it, that U.S. is a world empire. That's the only logical conclusion I can draw from here. So it's defending against whatever forces there are, local forces that's encroaching the empire from its periphery. If you look at those people at the center making decisions, whether you talk about military-industrial complex or military-industrial congressional complex, it's all these powerful people making decisions in Washington, D.C., but it's affecting in the remote corners of the world where American folks, folks on the street, they don't care. They couldn't even identify on the map where's Iraq. They couldn't even point out where's Iraq. It's pointless. Those wars are pointless. Those wars are not fought for them. And those wars are purely, I think, the way I see it and the way most Chinese see it, is that U.S. is fighting those wars to sustain its primacy in the world. That's basically a very realist position to say that U.S. must keep its hegemony in place. It's not, the perpetual war is beneficial not to the U.S. as a nation, but it's beneficial to probably the 30,000 defense contractors. It's just a very tiny bunch of the society. They are this corporate capitalist class. They are not, the genuinely peace-loving folks you meet on the streets. So what I find is, yes, you can go on the streets and shouting your slogans and say, okay, we demand change. You are a democratic government, so why are you not acting according to our will? Because it's people's will. What I find is a sad reality that it doesn't reflect people's will. There was this sinologist, Lucian Pye, who said a phrase about China is a civilization state pretending to be a nation state. So I say America is probably a corporate globalist empire pretending to be a sovereign state or a democratic republic. I think that's really sad. I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, well, let's start with your premise, which is that it's not simply Chinese people who want peace.
Yeah,
it's all humans, because the horror of war, the wretchedness of war, the magnitude of violence in war, it goes against everything that human beings want and desire. War really is the enemy of humanity. And yet we're plunged into many, many wars. And I think you're also doing the right thing by trying to understand what's causing the United States, which is a secure country. It has a vast ocean on its west, and it has a vast ocean on its east. It's not easy to invade the United States, not to mention its size, its magnitude, its population, its military. It's a well-protected country. The last time the U.S. was invaded was the War of 1812. That was more than 200 years ago. So of all the nations in the world, the U.S. is the least likely to be the target of military aggression. Doesn't mean things can't happen. It doesn't mean September 11th didn't happen, et cetera, et cetera. But in general, the U.S. has a military budget of almost $900 billion. It's about 4.5 times larger than China's. It's more than the Russian military budget is $60 billion. The budget of the DPRK of North Korea is the same size as the New York City Police Department budget, and yet North Korea is constantly treated as a huge menace. So what explains all this? What explains this endless war drive? So if we could, I'd just do a little sort of quick history, because there is an explanation to it. There is a way to understand it beyond just sort of providing a label to describe it or to designate it. The Department of Defense, as you mentioned, misnamed was formerly called the Department of War, which was correctly named. It was called the Department of War throughout World War II. And at the end of World War II, the U.S. demobilized. There was no military-industrial complex in 1946. The U.S. demilitarized. It reconverted its war economy to a peace economy. And immediately, the U.S. economy went into recession as it had been in depression in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. So part of the construction of a permanent war machine was an antidote to the cyclical crisis of capitalism, the boom-bust supply and demand crisis of capitalism, which routinely creates and still creates recessions and depressions every 5 or 6 or 7, or at the latest every 10 years. So by introducing a state subsidy to capitalist corporations, it was designed as a stabilizing impact. In other words, capitalism became more of a state capitalism in the United States vis-a-vis the introduction of military spending. But if you're spending all of this money on defense, you have to have a rationale to the public, because the money comes from our tax dollars. If we're having 30 or 40% of our salaries and wages taken by the government, and half of that money goes to the defense contractors, well, don't call them war contractors, call them defense contractors, because then it's something good. Then it's something noble. Then it's something to help us. It's to protect us. So the language changed after World War II. War became defense. And also the Korean War began in June 1950. And I think it's really important for the people watching this show to understand the centrality of the Korean War, because there was, on one side of the Korean War, you had the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union and North Vietnam and Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia and Poland and East Germany. You know, the socialist camp supported North Korea, and all of the capitalist countries supported South Korea. Mm-hmm. So you had a new division in the world just 5 years after the conclusion of World War II, whereby the United States and the other capitalist countries feared that revolution was spreading throughout Asia. I mean, there was the revolution in Korea, the revolution in China, the revolution in Vietnam, in Indonesia, the movement for independence in India. I mean, post-World War II was an era of national liberation movements, of independence for colonies and semi-colonies, and many of them gravitated towards China and the USSR because the socialist camp was giving them money, giving them assistance, giving them diplomatic support, giving them military support. So between 1945 and 1991, there was a war, a nonstop war. We call that the Cold War, but there were some very hot parts of the Cold War, like Korea, like Vietnam, where millions of mainly Asian people died. But at the end of 1990, when the Soviet Union collapsed and the socialist camp no longer existed, there became a new rationale provided for what had been by then a half-century long war drive by the U.S. There was no longer a major enemy. There was no longer an adversary. China was not considered to be an enemy at that point. China was being integrated into the world economy. The U.S. was moving to had already established normalized and friendly relations with the People's Republic of China. So now there became a new doctrine which provided a new public rationale for war, which was what's called the Wolfowitz Doctrine, the white paper that was established in 1991, 1992, whereby the U.S. said, look, we no longer have a major world global, adversary, but we have to make sure that no one ever again challenges the dominance of the United States anywhere in the world. So the U.S. decided to expand NATO rather than get rid of NATO. That was a way of incorporating all of Eastern and Central Europe, the former Soviet and Russian allies, into an American sphere of influence under American military discipline. That happened. There were 14 NATO countries in 1990. Now there are 30. And the doctrine that the US established was, we will make sure that no other regional or global power can ever emerge which challenges our hegemonic design, our domination. We don't call ourselves an empire. The British said they were an empire, and the sun never set on it, meaning its global reach was so vast. The US said, no, we're not a warlike country. We're not an empire. We only fight for defense. Look at our Department of Defense. It's not a Department of War. And we're not an empire. We're exceptional because, unlike other countries that were motivated by self-interest, we are so great. We are so wonderful. We are so democratic. We are like a shining light on the hill. We are the city on the hill. God created America. God bless America. You know, in this kind of propaganda, which is so dominant about American exceptionalism, then becomes a public rationale that unless we continue this global military enterprise with 800 military bases and almost, more than 1 million troops scattered all over the world, and the US constantly either intervening against countries, carrying out targeted assassinations with drones, imposing economic sanctions so that some countries are basically, the idea is to make their economy scream, as the US policymakers said it more cynically in the past. So now the US fears that Russia or China or some other regional powers, Iran in the Middle East, or possibly Venezuela before because it had a lot of oil, could emerge as regional or global contenders to American hegemony. So the US has decided in 1991 the principal means by which US domination will be maintained is by the endless and routine exercise of military power against others, either in the form of invasions, occupations, or threats. And that's what we think explains the endless war drive, even though we're protected by 2 oceans. Nobody's going to invade the United States. Nobody would dare invade the United States. But nonetheless, this fiction of defense is used as a public rationale for what exists as a replacement for the British Empire, the dominant empire in the globe.
Thank you for your very elaborate explanation. I think we agree on a lot of things because, well, you say you have a socialist program, and the way we analyze things are really similar because we almost look at the world through the same lens. But just one of the things that really I found interesting is that since you mentioned the British Empire, I think empires has a long tradition, okay? There were the Mongol Empire, Byzantine Empire, whatever empire there was, but those were regional empires trying to expand to a greater part of the world, but they were regional. And the first truly global empire was the British Empire. The British Empire invented this thing called free trade. Okay, free trade is the basis of their empire, and their empire is sort of a transitional empire. Then America took over the British Empire, not calling itself a formal empire. And an underlying thing is globalization, right? Globalization is much more than bringing the world together. It's much more than connectivity. I think we understood globalization too shallow. I mean, our understanding of globalization was too shallow because we thought it was just about global connectivity. But no, globalized to globalization, there's no subject, there's no object, just a verb. Who globalizes what? I mean, you're globalizing the local factors. You're bringing the local factors and spreading them throughout your trading network. But who is doing this? It's the capitalist class. We tend to forget or we tend to cover this up. So we just say, oh, globalization. Okay, it's an inherently good thing. It's a moral thing to do, that development comes from globalization as a result of globalization. But no, globalization is creating wealth, but the wealth created is disproportionately distributed among the people. So, 20 years ago, Thomas Friedman said the world is flat. But the world is flat for whom? You think about it, it's to this global capitalistic class is trying to bulldoze the world, get rid of all those barriers set forth by sovereign states. Discarding those barriers, let the capital flow freely across borders. That's the point of globalization. We're talking about economic base is capitalistic, but then the superstructure is somehow democratic. You want to create an image that people are in control, that somehow America is a national state, America has their say in politics, but increasingly you feel the disconnectedness between this superstructure and economic base. So that I find is the reason that this endless war is propagating and people have not much means to stop because the communist movement has been silent since Soviet Union collapsed. I believe your progressive elements in the United States society also was not the mainstream voice, I believe. So I'm curious to know what you think about the future. What can we do to let people wake up to this fact, or do you think people already know? Americans, ordinary Americans, do they already know this? Or what are you trying to do with your message?
Every society where people are trying to make transformational change, radical change, and in my case, I'm a socialist and a lifelong socialist. People are always a pretty small minority until a certain set of circumstances develop that allow a previously marginalized or seemingly fringe idea become popular and massive in its popularity very rapidly. That's the history. Let's talk about globalization, for instance. Globalization is, since you brought it up, there's been different stages of globalization. When Christopher Columbus set sail for the so-called New World, that was the beginning of a real globalization. And it was very, very bad for the people whose land became, quote, globalized, because globalized meant this nascent capitalist class, which Marx and Capital described that the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class came into existence as a class with blood and dirt dripping from every pore. And it's poetry in a way in Capital, but it's accurate. When you look at what actually happened to the people in Central America, the indigenous people in Central and the northern part of what we now call Latin America, the people were literally lived in mines and never saw daylight, never came up above, never saw the light of day in their entire existence. They were born in the mines. The more privileged miners were closer to the surface. In the Spanish Empire, Portugal, the colonial empires of Europe, which were really the capitalist classes, because the working classes, the people who went to work every day or worked in the fields, they weren't rich. But this growing accumulation of capital, the globalization was the key to it. In the case of America, is the United States a democratic republic? Well, yes. Yes, it is. And was it a democratic republic at the time that in many parts of the country, the majority population was enslaved? Yes, that's also true. South Carolina, at the time the Civil War happened, the majority of people were enslaved. The majority. It wasn't a minority, it was the majority. Were there elections in South Carolina? Yes, there were. Was it a republic? Florida was majority Black and majority enslaved. So you had democracy for some and the enslavement of others. So when you think about Greek democracy, Athenian democracy, it's similar. Also, we learned the idea of democracy, which comes from Greece, but the majority of Athenians were actually enslaved. The citizens who had the right to vote and create a democratic system did so on the backs of the labor of enslaved people in Greece. So this phenomena is not brand new, but the global economy has evolved. We are now in a position where the concentration of wealth is even greater than it was 200 years ago, and certainly greater than it was 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And so you have these globalizers, as you mentioned correctly, for their benefit. American jobs, say in Detroit, were destroyed. I mean, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who had decent paying jobs in Detroit or in Chicago or in West Virginia, those jobs were sent overseas in the 1990s. Why? Because you could pay workers in other countries a lower wage. And the technology was such that you could ship it back to the United States. So American companies, textile companies, could go to Bangladesh, produce shirts, send them thousands of miles away back, and American consumers could buy them for $8. I mean, and still the capitalists were making profit. So in some ways, it seemed like some parts of the world, especially the first world, the global north, not just the capitalists, but other parts of the population were actually thriving somewhat, even if they were oppressed, because they got lower priced goods based on the super extra exploitation of workers in the global south.
Yeah.
And so it's a cruel, brutal system. So as Marx described capitalism in its infancy, or now what we could say capitalism in its later stage, maybe as it enters its golden years, so to speak, the end of life, hopefully, the brutality is the constant. The brutality is the thematic continuity that exists in this system. So then finally, you're asking me, well, what do I think? What do I think about the future? As a socialist, where does change come from? Well, I believe American capitalism has entered a period of existential crisis, but it's not completely manifest in the sense that we all can see it, realize it, touch it, feel it. But it's coming, and you can, if you're making a careful assessment, and I do this without putting on rose-colored glasses and looking at the world through the way I want to look at it, but try to approach things with objective faculty. I think what we can see in the case of the United States is that society is facing three existential crises, which are not really solvable within the current framework of the American political / social order. Those crises are environmental catastrophe. Secondly, the endless war by the United States will, I believe, end up in major power confrontations. And the United States will not win. The United States didn't win in Korea, didn't win in Vietnam, didn't win in Afghanistan, but because none of the leaders who made these horrible decisions are ever held accountable for their horrible decisions, similar decisions are made over and over and over again. And I think the U.S. is on a fast track to having a confrontation with Russia and China, even though it seems insane. And the U.S. won't win. That's a second crisis. And there's a third crisis, which is the introduction of artificial intelligence and this exponential shift in technology and technological adaptations that are taking place will eliminate 50 or 60 or 70% of the existing jobs in the United States within the next 10 to 15 years. And under capitalism, where the capitalists, if they get rid of a worker, they say, goodbye, thank you very much for your service, and no one has any responsibility to that individual. It's like once you're no longer useful to the capitalist, you're on your own. In this, 100% pure capitalism, American capitalism, half the working class is going to be completely eviscerated as a consequence of the introduction of AI, artificial intelligence. So instead of artificial intelligence being a liberator in the end of backbreaking labor and sort of allowing the human family to do other things rather than work, have more time for culture, education, recreation, family, it will mean immiseration and poverty. These are the three, looming crises that U.S. capitalism is facing. And it's also a capitalism that is in a relative sense in decline because the rest of the world does not want to live under the domination of America. And so it's not ideological. India is not communist. Putin is not a communist. Xi Jinping is the leader of a communist party in China. So they're very different politically and ideologically. Iran is not communist, but they don't want to live under American domination. And so countries in big parts of the world are finding each other right now, not because of ideology, but because they have a common problem, which is American hegemony. And that is changing the relationship of forces in the world in a way that I don't believe the US will be able to overcome that. So I believe that the apparent stability in American capitalism will give way within a relatively short period of time. It might move to the left, which I believe as a socialist it can, and there's more and more popularity of socialism here. Most young people in America now think socialism is a good thing, not a bad thing. But we also have the danger of fascism in America because the military-industrial complex, faced with a rising progressive socialist young population, would prefer to go with these revanchist reactionaries who think the real problem for the United States is that the United States is not white enough, not powerful enough, is introducing non-traditional family values, et cetera, et cetera. So there's going to be a crisis in American society. You can see it clearly emerging. It can go to the left in a socialist direction, but it could also go to the right. This is not something that has been settled. It's a battle that hasn't yet been fully fought. So that's how I evaluate things inside the U.S.
Right, right. Well, I certainly hope that U.S. will go to the left direction. But yeah, it just reminds me that there's this slogan from the right: "Take back control, or take back the country." That the country is held in the hands of the deep state. That they're, it's sort of people on the left and on the right have something in common. That this country is unjustly, inappropriately taken by vested interest, and it doesn't reflect the people's will. But what is the people's will? Well, that's subject to debate from the right and also on the left. But then you just mentioned a very interesting point about the U.S. being less able to win the wars overseas, which I think is definitely right, because while in the past, many people, especially in the 19th century or 18th century, people were not politicized. They were like feudal subjects, so they would not have nationalism to unite them, to fight for something that's in common. And also that's also happened in the United States, where you have the settler culture. People in this village have very little common with people in that village. You belong to German descent, Irish descent, So people were disconnected. But now this is a world of nation states. So you have Iraqis. The more you push them, the more you try to crush them, the more action, reaction, they will bounce back and they will form insurgents. So you have huge trouble to deal with them. So I think the United States, yes, it's a very powerful country, spends like 1/4 of the world's defense spending, or one third, I don't know. Okay, you can spend that amount of money, but in the end you have like this finite number of troops, the number of troops on the ground, plus, defense contractors, okay, whatever, that you'll be vastly outnumbered by people who have a problem with your hegemony. Like you said, there are many other state actors, and also many of whom with a rich history and also a civilization in their own. For example, Islamic civilization. If you want to take a look at the world through the lens of civilizations, you will see, okay, the Indian subcontinent, even the Europeans, they are not on the same boat, perhaps with the exception of the UK. So people everywhere has issues with this global hegemony of the United States. So I think that way is that US is not able to win its wars on the battleground. But then it suddenly occurred to me, the objective of these perpetual wars is not winning. It just occurs to me, the objective of defense contractors, Pentagon, or the Congress is not winning, it's to sustain their power. You know, they want political contribution. They want to give them contracts. It's to sustain the power cycle among themselves. So it's not really about U.S. has to win the war. It's even better that U.S. loses a war against, Iraqi insurgents or Afghanistan Taliban. It's even better. So you have more reason to pour in more money from the taxpayers of ordinary citizens who has zero reason to care about war or conflicts in those areas, because that doesn't reflect their interest. But what can the people do? I mean, that is, I believe, we will have more dialogues like this. To tell them that your interest doesn't align with the interest of that capitalistic class, or so the military, industrial, congressional complex. Your interest doesn't align with them. So we are the many, they are the few, but somehow I think we got to, I don't know, I don't want to use the word educate, but we want to let the masses know that they are in what situation they're in.
Well, the capitalist class as a ruling class, is pretty experienced. They've had a long time about ruling. So when they're making their calculations, I think it's important to think, to really think deeply about what their calculation is. Take the war in Ukraine, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. has now sent about $150 billion of weapons to Ukraine. And the U.S. is quite content with the war going on and on. As you said, as long as they don't lose completely, in the case of Ukraine, if they don't win, not that big of a deal, actually. They think, well, over time it will strain or sap Russia, it might weaken Russia over time. And we're making tons of money. We, the military contractors, making so much money because every missile that goes there has to be replenished, right? So it's like this, it's great because how do you get rid of weapons? You can only get rid of them by using them in war. I mean, there's a unique nature of war commodities compared to every other commodity, which circulates because people use other commodities, my shirt, my pants, my car. But war goods, war contracts, they only can be used in war. And so this is kind of a good thing for them. But think about another element to this. If the U.S. ruling class were to send American soldiers to Ukraine to fight on behalf of this noble cause, because they said it's noble, to defend the sovereignty of Ukraine. And they're so committed to Ukraine that they're going to send $150 billion. But if they sent thousands of young Americans to fight, the demonstration we had on March 18th would not have been several thousand. It would have been several hundred thousand. And I think it's very important for all of us to realize what the ruling class in America realizes, which is that the American people actually are not, ready to go to war with Russia or China or another Iraq. If the U.S. were to do it, it would create a political firestorm in the United States. Our organization would become, millions of people would support us. And that's the reality. So there's this limitation on the American empire, which you don't really notice because the ruling class chooses not to test the limitation. The limitation is, what do the American people actually think? What are they willing to do? When you ask a parent, send your son or your daughter to die, to kill and to be killed, they have to believe that this is a good cause. It's like you said, it's not the 17th century where, humans were like cattle or sheep that could be just driven to war. The public reality of contemporary society is human beings have consciousness, and that consciousness is a factor in the political calculations of any government or any ruling class. So the U.S., the contradiction here is the U.S. has endless bases, but why are they using proxies? Why are they using drones? Why don't they, if the war cause is so noble, why don't they send the American people to go and really in large numbers fight? Because the American people won't do it. And so in that sense, what we called when I was a teenager, during the Vietnam War, the Vietnam syndrome, meaning Americans don't want to go fight these wars in other places, countries they don't understand. As you said in the beginning, they couldn't have placed them on the map. They don't know their language, their culture, their religion, their history. They don't even know where they are. But if you're going to send your son and your daughter to go and maybe lose their life, no, the American people don't want that. They learned the lesson of Vietnam. So there's this sort of latent anti-war sentiment that is very real. Trump is emphasizing in his new 2024 campaign opposition to the Ukraine war because it's popular. It's not just popular with leftists. It's not just popular with progressives or socialists. It's popular with everybody. My family, my extended family, I come from a working class family in industrial cities. Half of my extended family were voting for Trump. They might have also voted for Bernie Sanders, by the way, which is really interesting. They're not left, they're not progressive, they're workers, they're poor people, basically, but they're all against the war. They're against any war. And so it's very important not to over stereotype or label the American people as a bunch of reactionaries or, like, not that you were doing it, but I mean, like, I could understand why the rest of the world might think the Americans are just sort of a lost cause.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to correct that stereotype too. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So anyway, this is a limitation on American power because the U.S. doesn't really, they couldn't go to another war in the Middle East. I think they're preparing for a war with China, but look at the contradiction. Like, are you really, I mean, if there are thousands of battlefield casualties in the East China Sea or South China Sea or in Korea, I think the American people will rise up against that as they have been recently.
Yeah, I think so. Just as you were speaking, it suddenly occurred to me that, okay, you want to bring this message to as many as American people out there as possible. And I think the way we phrase it, the way we write our message is really important because the capitalist class, they are very clever in the way they phrase things. Like, it just suddenly occurred to me that they used the word security. Like, America want a rule-based world order that it basically underwrites the world's security to act like the world's policeman. And it occurs to me that the kind of public good that America offers to the world in this liberal international order is security. It can't even say it's a public good because it's a traded commodity. Because people have to pay for those rockets and bombs. It's a commodity, making money out of it. So it's not a public good. And America just say, the propaganda of the mainstream media is to say that America offers this public good, security as public good. Whereas I think China, the kind of public good we envision that China could provide to the world is development. It's basically to live and let live, to have a chance, to have a chance in this era of peace and stability, and let's just make some money together. I make some money, you make some money. Is that China doesn't have this ability to provide security, or let alone manipulate the demand and supply of security. Say to create extremist forces, to call them freedom fighters and use CIA secretly fund them to create a demand for your weapons. And China doesn't have that ability, and I think it's an ability that's unique to the United States, which is sustained by its dollar, the supreme status of dollar as the world's currency, reserve currency. But I think this is also showing cracks to some extent, that the hegemony of dollar is undermined with the rise of other currencies, including yuan. But we shouldn't forget that how ruthless that America strikes back Even in recent memory, like the war in Iraq, or to create tension in Europe, for example, in former Yugoslavia, in the Balkans, just like euro was strong, was just nascent euro, another strong currency, to create regional instability. And that's a unique advantage that America enjoys. And I think we shouldn't underestimate that ability to manipulate supply and demand of security. It's really, really serious threat to world peace.
I agree. I couldn't agree with you more on that. You know, I was just with some Syrian American friends here, and there's a very large Syrian American community in America that was absolutely against what the U.S. did to Syria. They're secular people, you know, they don't want to live under Al-Qaeda. And, you know, Syria's not in the headlines anymore, but Syria's been devastated. I mean, what the U.S. did to Syria, I mean, those people, I mean, Syria's a beautiful country. The people had, by regional standards, a relative affluence before the Iraq war. Then millions of Iraqis became refugees. That put a lot of, but Syria's like suffering. Afghanistan, the people are starving to death. In Iraq, you know, the first time I went to Iraq, I went right before the first Gulf War. I went with Muhammad Ali, the boxer, and we traveled to Iraq, and we were so impressed because it's such a beautiful country and very secular, free healthcare, free education, highly educated population. You could hate Saddam Hussein, whatever, but socially, it was like an advanced social democratic society in the Arab Muslim world. Iraq is devastated. You think about Venezuela. I mean, you know, Maduro held on, but there's been oceans of human suffering caused by the American sanctions. Cuba has managed to survive, but under great hardship. It's an island. It can't live without interaction with the outside world. So you're right. I mean, we have to be I'm annoyed actually when I hear people talk about America's a contracting empire and America's on its last legs, and sort of dismiss the human suffering that's been caused by this empire just in the last 20 years. And whole society's ravaged, and it'll take generations for them to recover. So it's a terrible crime, actually. It's a criminal enterprise. And again, even after September 11th, you know, Bush and Cheney set up torture sites all over the world. They kidnapped people all over the world. They kidnapped and tortured them. They're obviously a violation of international law. Did any of them go to prison? Did any of the torturers go to prison? The only CIA person who went to prison was the person who revealed that the CIA had a torture program. His name was John Kiriakou. I co-hosted a radio show with him for several years. He went to prison because he told the truth. He went on ABC and said, "Oh yeah, we have a torture program. The president's not telling the truth." So they sent him to prison. So you have this impunity where criminal acts are committed all the time, ravaging whole societies. And the people who do it, they retire. They don't go to jail. They write books. They make speeches. They're considered elder statesmen. They're quite rich. And so all of that has to be, you know, brought into focus.
Yeah. So I think the only way to look on the brighter side of this is that we have this kind of voice from two sides of the Pacific, that we can agree on something, and we want to spread this voice to as many people as possible. So I hope we can, our voice will grow stronger.
Our voice will grow stronger. And I believe that there are so many inspiring examples of how this can happen. The worst thing for us would be to become hand-wringing, sort of pessimists, to rather see not just the bright side, but what we can do as people, how we can make a difference, how your show can make a difference, what we're doing on social media, because the only reason to do social media is you have to believe in people. because the idea is people, once they hear the truth and have a perspective, they become empowered. It's not simply to provide interesting content, but to really empower people to help make that change.
Yeah, I really like what you said. Not enough to make interesting content, but make a change. Yes, totally agree. Yeah, so I think I've learned quite a lot from you today. Yeah, I'm really thankful to that. I hope we can do this in the future too.